If you haven't been to my hometown already, then you never will. It's gone. Don't worry. I can guarantee nobody's missing the place. It was a tiny town to begin with, nestled in one of the most isolated regions of the US. I'm not going to give any specifics because I don't want anyone poking around. All I'll say is, if you take the right exit off the right interstate, if you keep driving down that dejected little road, then eventually the quaint cottages and gas stations will thin out. You'll speed past a long stretch of pristine woodland for an hour, and then you'll end up on the land where I was born and raised. A town that, at its peak, had a population of 378. The story of our existence is pretty straightforward. Now, you can imagine that we didn't have much in the way of wealth, but it was gorgeous out there in the boonies. It wasn't the kind of view you'd find in any city. Crystal clear lakes, endless pine forests that left your sinuses feeling tingly fresh, lush green grass perfect for lazy weekend picnics. It was a hidden piece of the world. Us townspeople, we were a tight-knit community. Our bonds strengthened through quiet isolation from the rest of the world. I grew up leaving the front door unlocked when I left for school in the morning. Maybe we were a little archaic in our ways, but that can only be expected from such a small settling. But as lovely as our sanctuary was, it wasn't going to last. The young people were leaving to go to college and navigate the far corners of the world. The old were getting older. You can't sustain people on happiness alone. When I was just a kid, 15 I think, this hotshot oil magnate decided that we would be the perfect destination for his summer home. Whittaker, that was the family name. I had never heard of him before, but he was big news. Worth more than everyone and everything in our town combined. He was seeking out a little slice of peace and quiet in the country, and he fell in love with the place right away. It wasn't like we had much choice in the matter. Whittaker had enough clout to mow down any opposition. And really, what would we have done? Staged a protest with our staggering numbers? For a year, there were the raucous construction crews, carving out a suitable lot from the earth. The mansion rose from the ground like an unstoppable force of nature. First, its raised brick foundation, then its bare bones frame, slowly packing on meat and muscle, and finally a red brick skin. Every day a swarm of flies in orange vests buzzing over our head. Every day, the sound of destruction and construction filling our ears. The Whittakers wanted an Olympic-sized pool in their backyard, so they chopped down trees and drained streams. The Whittakers were worried about local wildlife hurting their pair of Great Danes, so they had trappers brought in to wipe out the coyotes and foxes. Suddenly, there was a rancid tinge to the fresh country air, resentment bitter and strong on our tongues. Nobody likes a stranger coming into their home. I tried to ignore it. I tried to settle back into normality. I took a job, babysitting for $5 an hour and volunteering at our town's senior center on Sundays. Well, it was really just Mrs. Watterson's house, which she opened up on the weekends for the white-haired and cloudy-eyed to gather together and play blackjack and poker. My job was to refill the jugs of mint iced tea, help out if someone wanted something from a high shelf, and make sure Mrs. Watterson's dog didn't soil the carpet. The old folks were nice enough to me when they weren't too busy trading old gossip over the card games. They grumbled about the construction, of course, but I tuned them out. It made things fade into the background for a while. When the mansion was finally done, the town held its breath until the day the family pulled up in a glossy black limo. There was Whittaker and his wife, and Caroline, their 17-year-old daughter. the three of them tall and regal and groomed. Caroline was the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. She made me and the other girls in town look ridiculously plain, with her wardrobe of designer clothes and French manicures. But there was something cold about her, something that kept any of us from trying to talk to her. Not that there were that many opportunities for that anyway. Her family rarely left their sprawling villa. They had no reason to. There was nothing in the town for them. Nothing at all, and the feeling was mutual. We wanted to forget they were there at all. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Not on our end. Their mansion towered high over our clapboard houses, making us feel small, insignificant. In the weeks following their arrival, there was fresh discontent brewing in the senior home. Nobody wanted them there. Half their conversations were spent talking about how Whittakers didn't belong here. They needed to leave. They'd get what was coming to them. Still, in the midst of all the townspeople's anger, I couldn't help but feel drawn to the family and their otherworldly existence. In my head, I came up with a name for them, Shinies. I thought it suited them well, you know what I mean? The luster of salon-treated hair and plumped glossy lips. The oiled, overstretched look of skin that'd seen one too many facelifts. The sheen of custom-tailored Armani suits and strings of Tahitian white pearls. Shiny smiles and shiny purses and shiny shoes and shiny houses. Everything about them was so shiny. I was dazzled. On the rare occasions that I did see them in person, I couldn't help but stare, transfixed by the family that seemed to have come from another time in another world. Over time, thank God, the starstruck feeling began to ebb away. I guess I went through an adjustment period like any other, except I was adjusting to the fact that there were people who existed outside of my town, something which had never really seemed to cement itself in my brain before. With enough time, it seemed that things were going to return to normal. Until the construction of the statues. Mr. Whittaker, the magnate himself, was a man with a lot of bravado. He thought pretty highly of himself. I wasn't oblivious to the rumors passing around town either. People said that he'd been born with nothing and built his oil empire from the ground up. A true rags to riches story, except instead of becoming some sort of good-hearted philanthropist, he'd become obsessed with his wealth and reputation. Don't get me wrong, I'm not usually the type to go around making assumptions about people without getting to know them first, but I think ordering the construction of 20-foot-tall statues of everyone in your family is just a tad arrogant. The statues weren't built on site. I don't know if it would have been better or worse, seeing them constructed day by day, or having them appear all at once. 3 gigantic effigies of the beautiful Whittakers. Their bronze surface is even shinier than the real thing, if not quite as stiff. Whittaker in his tux, the wife with the pinched face, and Caroline standing between them. The statues didn't just go in his front yard or anything like that. No, he bought the deed to the town park and put his immortalized family as the centerpiece. The way things were going, it seemed like he was trying to make our town into his own creepy little paradise. There was speculation about his plans to drive all of us out of the town, so he could rebuild from the ground up. It's funny how it sounds odd when I write it now. At the time, it felt like Whittaker was some sort of all-powerful being that could do with the town what he pleased. The year after the statues, they started drilling for oil. My mother told me it should have been obvious from the beginning. He hadn't come for the greenery and lakes. No, he had come to oversee the operation, and it wasn't going to be a small one. I suppose it should have bothered me more. You should have seen the reactions when the news got out. But me? I was 17 by then. Almost ready to move out and find my own way in the world. I was more preoccupied with thoughts of my future. But what happened that summer was enough to tear me out of my own thoughts. In July, before the drilling commenced, our town had a homegrown tragedy. I'm sure not everyone would opt to call it that, but then again, not everyone had their head on straight at the time. Caroline Whittaker was kidnapped in the dead of night. People had gone missing in our town before. Drunks who had stumbled off into the woods while they were wasted off their asses, or kids who had strayed too far from the path, but they were nobodies. This was the biggest thing that had ever happened in our town. Everyone knew by the following day. We knew by the police cars that peeled into our town, one after the other in an orderly row, rattling on the bumpy roads. I remember there being more cars than there should have been, but hey, this was a Whittaker, not to mention a pretty young white girl. I guess it's a miracle the entire police force didn't show up on our doorstep. I didn't say it, but I was sure it was just a rebellious thing. With parents like that, I wouldn't have blamed her. I suspected that she was in a nightclub somewhere, or slumming it in a big city. She was on a beach in Costa Rica, shopping in Dubai. I don't think I was the only one who thought that either. Nobody really thought it was a serious matter, which made all the swarms of police and news reporters seem a little comical. Despite all the media publicity, the Whittakers started showing themselves even less than before in our town, and then not at all. And if you asked now, years after the whole thing went down, they would never admit it, but there were some people who were glad that it had happened. I don't know how anybody could be that vindictive, but the sentiment was undeniably there, like something sour lingering in the atmosphere. For a while, she was all that people talked about. When a week passed and Caroline didn't come running back, I thought nothing of it. 2 weeks went by. I wondered if she was on the last leg of her little trip. Then 3 weeks. There was the possibility she'd taken a detour before returning home. When the month had come to an end, and Caroline was nowhere to be seen, that was when I began to have my doubts. Not that she was alive. That I was still sure of for some unnameable reason, but that she was safe. 1 month, and then another, and another, and another, until Caroline's name faded from our lips. Nobody saw the Whittakers leave their house. People wondered if they had moved out in the dead of night. I doubt that her parents ever made peace with it. It's not like they had another perfect child to move on to, and Caroline was supposed to have inherited her family's company when she was older. They'd lost all of that in the blink of an eye. Personally, I was adamant in my belief that Caroline was alive somewhere in the world. Something terrible had happened to her, and I didn't know what that something was, but it seemed impossible that she was truly dead. Yeah, I was in denial over someone that I hardly knew. I knew that if I looked too deeply into it, I would realize that the odds were that she was almost certainly dead, but I was a late bloomer who had finally discovered boys right around the time of her disappearance, and that just about pushed out every other thought in my mind. I graduated high school with decent grades, and practically no knowledge of what existed outside of the town boundaries. I decided I was going to remedy that. Saying goodbye to my mom and dad was hard, but they understood that I had to leave, had to find my own way. And find my own way I certainly did. The next few years flew by, so much compacted into such a short period of time. With everything changing in the blink of an eye, I changed too, and soon my sleepy childhood in that sleepy little no-name town seemed farther away than the dim stars in the city sky. You don't need to hear the details of my life in the 6 years that I left home. I grew up, got my degree, married an aspiring writer named Jonathan against the wishes of a family I had grown apart from by then. To tell you the truth, when I finally decided to visit my hometown, it was Jonathan's idea, not mine. It was over a late morning breakfast of pancakes and dark coffee that he brought it up. "Now that the car's fixed, let's go somewhere this weekend, honey." "Where did you have in mind?" "The place where you grew up. You know everything about me, Samantha. I want to know everything about you. It's only fair, isn't it?" he said, smiling. I wasn't too enthusiastic about the idea. I knew it meant having to talk to my parents again, and awkward encounters with old friends. But Jonathan was so insistent that I told myself to suck it up and pack my things up for a trip. I remember the drive clearly. We listened to pop music on the radio with the windows rolled down. It was only when we started nearing our destination that the mood shifted. It wasn't tense, just contemplative. With the sight of the dense, luscious green trees lining the road, bringing back a rush of memories. It was scary how little the town had changed. The faces were older, but otherwise, everything was exactly as I had remembered it. The houses were as quaint as ever, and it being the middle of spring, the air was heavy with a smell that was green and vital. The reunion with my parents went much better than expected. I guess they'd finally come around, and they welcomed Jonathan with a homemade meal and polite smiles. As my dad regaled Jonathan with stories about me as a clumsy little kid, and my mom loaded more food onto his plate, I glanced at the photos hanging on the walls and reminisced about my childhood. Dinner was delicious. It had been a weird sort of day, but the beef stew and fresh-baked bread was so good that any trace of residual anxiousness slipped out of sight and out of mind. I guess that was why I built up the courage to ask my mom the question. "So, Mom, did they ever find that girl who went missing when I was a teenager? You must remember, I think her name was Carol or Courtney." Truth was, I remembered her name perfectly. My mom's eyes bore into me. "Ah, the Whittaker girl. Her name was Caroline. Pretty girl, wasn't she?" "No, they didn't find her, Samantha. It's such a pity. There was so much hope at the beginning, too." I knew she was being genuine. My parents were one of the few who had never held much of a grudge against the Whittaker family. "What happened to her parents?" I asked. "They left town for good about a year after Caroline disappeared," my father cut in. "I don't think it needs to be said that they terminated all their drilling plans. Losing a daughter like that, I can't imagine what it was like for them." This sparked Jonathan's interest, and we spent the next 10 minutes talking about Caroline, the tragic case of the beautiful teenage girl who vanished one night and never returned. Suddenly things were as fresh in my memory as they were when I was 17. I remembered the last time I had seen her. Something about that particular incident had bothered me, but I'd forgotten about it soon after. It had been in the park. I was sitting on a bench, hands tucked under my legs, waiting for one of my friends to show up. I was so absorbed in something that had happened that day before that I didn't see Caroline when she first walked in. It was only when she came closer that I realized it was her, blonde hair and all. I was a little stunned. It was pretty early in the day and nobody else was at the park except for the two of us. I'd never seen Caroline up close before, and certainly not when there was nobody else around. Now that she was pacing nervously, only meters from me, I could see the delicate outline of her profile, the silky texture of the white shirt that she was wearing, and I could see the nervous look on her face. It was fear, sure enough. Her hands wouldn't stay still, and her eyes were wide and shining. She was walking in short, speedy bursts before stopping altogether and standing still. She kept glancing up at the statues of her family, an ugly expression coming over her features every time she did. I didn't say anything to her. I only watched as she untied the jacket around her waist and put it on, even though it was a sunny day. One of the Whittakers' cars appeared around the corner soon after, and she slipped into it, never even realizing that I was there. It scared me how well I remembered the whole thing. That night, as I snuggled under the covers of my old room, I kept going back to that memory, replaying it in my mind the way you might an especially entrancing scene in a movie. The next day, I walked around town aimlessly with Jonathan. He likened himself a photographer, even though he only had one clunky old camera and had never taken classes. And every 5 minutes, he had to stop to take pictures of whatever he thought looked interesting. Huge oak trees, the church steeple, flowers in full bloom. Finally, we reached the park, and I could tell how excited he was when he saw the statues. I had been wrong about things being the same as I had left them. The statues had fallen into disrepair. Any trace of shine was gone, replaced by a thick layer of rust that marred their handsome features. The eyes looked as soulless as ever. With the whole creepy aura and troubling history, I doubted anyone had come near them in a very, very long time. Jonathan exclaimed that there was a morbid beauty in them, and insisted that I get up onto the pedestal to get a better shot. He was too heavy for me to boost him, so it had to be me. I reluctantly agreed. Hey, don't get me wrong. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but he was so enthusiastic about it, I couldn't say no. Jonathan helped me up onto the base of Caroline's statue. I stared up at the rusted creature. I had to hold onto the leg for balance. The texture underneath my hands was gritty and unpleasant. I took the photo with my free hand and gave the camera back to Jonathan. I jumped down, letting go of the statue's leg. When I was safely on the ground, I noticed that my hand had come away from the statue wet. It was strange, because when I had put my hand onto the thing, I hadn't noticed any wetness. It must have leaked out of some minuscule crack. I sniffed it and nearly threw up. "Jesus, Sam, what is that?" Jonathan asked. "Is that from the statue?" I was still gagging. "It's disgusting! Oh God, it smells like... Suddenly, it hit me what it smelled like. "John, I need you to boost me back up." His brows furrowed. "Wait, what do you..." "Just help me up." The look on my face shut him up right away. Only one thing was on my mind. I needed to confirm something that I had suspected since I was a teenager, but never bothered to test out. Once I was back on the pedestal, I gave the statue a hard rap with my hand. It made a blunt noise. Jonathan had a metal water bottle with him, and I told him to give it to me. I slammed it against the statue again, this time using all my force, and it was just as I suspected. Still a blunt impact noise, but now a suggestion of a ringing echo. The statues were hollow. A shadow of an idea was forming in my head. My stomach was a tight ball, my heart beating dizzily fast. I touched my hand to the same place as before, and yes, there it was. A crack leaking the tiniest rivulet of fluid. "There's something inside." He stared up at me. "What?" "There's something inside the statue. John, honey, we need to call the police." I will tell you the rest of the day as clearly as I can. I don't remember all of it. Time changes when terrible things are happening. The police arrived. Well, they arrived twice. First, the sheriff from a town a few miles away from ours. Then the real deal. A fleet of cars with sirens flashing red and blue. What I do remember, I remember in snapshots. The crowd pouring in, the confused clamor, The cops asking people to kindly step away from the statue. The smell still on my hand. The man in the uniform who drilled a hole into the metal and twisted away when he was sprayed with a ribbon of black water. The crowd watched. People covered their mouths and noses, first with their hands, then with fabric. The crowd kept watching, this time behind a yellow tape perimeter, as the statue was painstakingly opened up over the course of several hours. The pedestal base had once had a latch door that could be opened, allowing for access to the inside of the statue, but that had been cemented shut 7 years ago. News reporters rolled in. I stood at the edge of the crowd with Jonathan's arm draped around me and barely responded to anything he said. I was watching. We were all watching. That was us making up for the watching that we had failed to do in the past 7 years. We watched and waited and watched. We watched the dark water coming out in trickles at first. Then, as the cement in the pedestal was chipped away, we watched it pour forth in one big rush. It pooled for a second before sinking into the grass and staining it dark. The smell was so pungent that I turned away and emptied my stomach onto the ground. We watched as the colorless, broken thing that was once Caroline Whittaker was removed from the statue by 2 workers in hazmat suits. Caroline Whittaker had never gone to Costa Rica or Dubai. She had not had her organs stolen, or been trafficked to some foreign country, or simply been shot and left to die. She had been kept alive for 41 days inside her own statue, decaying, losing her mind in a space that had no light and no sound. She couldn't scream. Her vocal cords had been cut. The one thing she did have? Water. The interior of the statue had been filled with water up to Caroline's neck, so if she wanted a drink, she could have it. The water that her body had been stewing in for 7 years after her death.